He didn't look like someone in a hurry to save the day. His chain squeaked, his laces were untied, and his eyes stayed focused straight ahead. No one watching him fly past on that old bike would have guessed he had a mission. Least of all the officers in the patrol car who saw only a black teenager speeding down a sidewalk, weaving between pedestrians. It looked wrong, suspicious even, so they pulled him over. But what started as a routine stop quickly became something else. Because tucked inside his bag, beneath a folded hoodie and an almost crushed juice box, was a letter. A handwritten note marked urgent, and it wasn't addressed to a friend. It wasn't homework. It was meant for a man waiting alone in a hospital room, one whose time was slipping fast. A man who hadn't seen his grandson in years, and if the police didn't let that boy go soon, he wouldn't get the chance to say goodbye. What began as suspicion turned into something no one saw coming, a race against the clock, and a truth that changed the way they saw him forever. The sun hadn't fully risen when he pushed open the apartment door, the hinges squeaking softly as he stepped into the chilled morning air. The hallway was dim and quiet, lit only by a flickering fluorescent light near the stairwell. His sneakers made soft sounds on the concrete as he moved quickly, careful not to let the door slam behind him and wake his grandmother. She was still asleep. He knew that. She needed the rest. It had been a long night. Her cough had rattled through the paper-thin walls well past midnight, and he'd lain awake listening to it, heart pounding not with fear, but with a deep ache he couldn't name. His backpack felt heavier than usual, slung across his shoulders, not because of its contents. There were no books, just a folded hoodie and a wrapped sandwich, but because of what else it carried. Inside, tucked carefully between the layers of cloth, was a white envelope. It was old-fashioned, unsealed, soft at the corners, the handwriting faded but neat. That envelope carried more weight than anything he had ever held before. It had been written last night, after a quiet, whispered conversation. He hadn't asked questions. He didn't need to. He understood enough. The name written on it belonged to a man he hadn't seen in years, a man others in the family didn't talk about anymore. But it didn't matter. Today, he would ride. He took the stairs 2 at a time, emerging into the gray light of early morning. The city around him was just beginning to stir. Storefront gates were still down, trash bins lined the curb, and steam curled from vents in the street. He ran toward the old bike that leaned against the rusted fence, its paint chipped, one pedal slightly bent, the back tire slightly low. But it was enough. It had always been enough. He had fixed it himself, one weekend at a time, with tools borrowed from neighbors and YouTube videos watched in the dark. The handlebars were wrapped with electrical tape, and the seat wobbled slightly, but he knew its every creak and rattle. He hopped on without hesitation. His knees rose high with each rotation of the pedals. His legs were too long for it now, but he didn't care. The ride wasn't about comfort. It was about time. The hospital was 14 blocks away, not far, but far enough when you didn't have long. He knew the layout of the route better than he knew some of his own family, which alleys cut behind traffic lights, which sidewalks were wider, which streets had fewer potholes. He had mapped it out the night before with care, as his grandmother whispered, then coughed, then whispered again. "First light," she had said. "Don't be late." The wind was sharp. It stung his cheeks and made his eyes water, but he didn't slow down. With each turn of the pedals, the city passed by in fragments. Chain-link fences, empty bus stops, a dog barking behind a gate, trash swept into corners. The usual noises of early morning began to rise, a car starting, a train rumbling in the distance, the crunch of gravel under passing wheels. But he focused only on the road. He didn't have time to let the world distract him. Not today. Not when every second felt measured. He passed a bakery with its windows fogged from inside. The smell of fresh bread hit him, and his stomach growled in protest. He hadn't eaten since the day before, but hunger wasn't what pushed him now. It was something else. Urgency mixed with something sacred. The envelope in his bag wasn't just a note. It was a bridge, one between his grandmother and a man who used to be family and still was, even if years had passed without a word. Even if bitterness and silence had filled the space between them. That didn't matter anymore. Illness made time shorter. Forgiveness couldn't wait for convenience. He ducked under a low branch, swerved to avoid a puddle, and kept going. His breath came hard and fast now. His legs ached. His fingers tingled from the cold gripping the metal. He didn't stop, didn't even think about it. At an intersection, he didn't wait for the light. He looked both ways and cut across, heart hammering. A car honked, but he was already gone. He knew it wasn't safe. He knew he could get in trouble. But this was not a regular day. He wasn't a regular boy. And this wasn't just a ride. As he turned down the longer stretch of road that would take him toward the commercial strip, the sun finally broke the horizon. It bathed the buildings in pale gold, made the dew on the windows glisten. He blinked against the light. A traffic light ahead flashed yellow. He stood up on the pedals and pushed harder. The hospital was only a few turns away now. He could almost see it in his mind. The beige bricks, the metal awning, the glass doors that never closed. He thought about the man inside, the man who once gave him a baseball glove he never used, who once showed up at his birthday and then disappeared. He thought about how that man now waited alone in a hospital room, not knowing that a boy he barely remembered was coming. But he was. He had to. He crossed another street, then another. The buildings grew taller here, more storefronts, more people starting to appear on sidewalks. He wove around a woman walking her dog, past a group of kids waiting for a school bus. They barely noticed him. To them, he was just a blur, a kid on a bike, riding fast, too fast. No one asked where he was going, no one knew what he carried, but he felt it. On his back, in his chest, in the soles of his shoes. This was a message that needed to arrive. One final message between a woman who had loved quietly all her life and a man who had gotten lost somewhere along the way. If he could get there in time, maybe something could be made whole again. Maybe something broken could be mended. And then, just as he turned onto the final block before the main avenue, he heard it. A short, sharp siren chirp. The sound of tires crunching behind him. The familiar command of a loudspeaker. "Stop right there." He knew instantly what it was. Police. A patrol car. Probably saw him running lights. Saw him swerving on the sidewalk. Saw him, a black boy on a ragged bike, riding too fast, looking like a problem. His heart didn't stop, but it stumbled. Not out of guilt, but out of fear. Not of what would happen to him, but of what wouldn't happen if he didn't get there in time. He braked hard and turned his head slowly. The cruiser rolled to a stop beside him. The doors opened. 2 officers stepped out. Their hands weren't on their weapons, but they weren't smiling either. He stayed still, bike straddled between his legs, sweat cold on his forehead despite the morning chill. The envelope was still in his backpack, warm from his body. He glanced at the cruiser, then at the road ahead, then at the officers again. He didn't know how to explain in a way that would make sense quickly enough. He didn't know if they'd listen. He only knew he couldn't afford to lose a single minute more. The moment he brought his bike to a halt, the city seemed to pause with him. The early morning clatter of buses and distant horns still echoed faintly in the background, but around him the air had changed. It was no longer just cold, it was heavy, tense. His breath clouded in front of his face as he stood motionless, one sneaker planted on the pavement and the other balancing on a pedal. His hands remained fixed on the handlebars, knuckles pale against the worn rubber grips. Behind him, the police cruiser idled softly, its engine humming like a warning. The 2 officers had stepped out of the vehicle almost at the same time, their steps controlled but unmistakably alert. One was tall and broad with a sharp jawline, the other leaner, his expression veiled behind dark sunglasses despite the morning gloom. They didn't draw their weapons, didn't shout, but their posture spoke volumes, shoulders stiff, arms angled just enough to suggest readiness for anything. To them, this was precaution. To him, it was interruption, an obstruction in a day that could not afford even one. He didn't speak first. He had learned that silence could be safer, even if it didn't protect him from what people thought they saw. They probably assumed he was cutting school or delivering something illegal. His hoodie, slightly torn at the sleeve, and his scuffed shoes weren't doing him any favors. Neither did the color of his skin, which for some people translated to suspicion before a word was ever spoken. He could almost hear the internal calculations being made as they sized him up. Too fast, too out of place, too black in a neighborhood that had changed faces and expectations over the last 10 years. One officer approached slowly while the other stayed by the cruiser, eyes scanning up and down the sidewalk. The first officer's voice was calm but direct, asking where he was going and if the bike was his. The questions weren't loud, but they carried an assumption: guilt, until proven otherwise. The boy answered softly, his voice steady but strained. Yes, it was his bike. Yes, he was headed somewhere. Yes, he had a reason. But even the truth sounded flimsy under scrutiny, like excuses dressed in quiet tones. The officer nodded, unconvinced, and gestured toward the backpack. He hesitated. His heart sped up. The envelope was in there, still safely tucked beneath his hoodie, still sealed, still vital. He had thought this trip through in so many ways, but not this one, not being stopped, not being delayed when time meant everything. He slipped the bag from his shoulders and handed it over, trying not to let his urgency rise to the surface. Panic wouldn't help. Panic would only make them believe their suspicion had merit. The taller officer flipped the bag open. Inside, he found the hoodie, a squished juice box, and a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. Nothing dangerous, nothing unusual, except for the envelope, which he pulled out carefully. His eyes narrowed as he read the name on the front. Charles Williams. He asked the boy again who that was. The boy answered quickly this time. His grandfather. The man was in the hospital and he was trying to get there now. The letter was from his grandmother. It was important. The officer's grip on the envelope loosened. He didn't say anything right away. There was a pause, brief but deep. The second officer had approached by now, leaning over to peer into the backpack as well. They exchanged a glance, barely a twitch of acknowledgement, but it was enough to shift the atmosphere. The boy watched them closely. Every second felt stretched, and each one lost could be the one that made the difference between goodbye and too late. One officer asked how far he had left to go. The boy told him the hospital wasn't far, just 10 more blocks, maybe less. His voice was firmer now, threaded with the kind of urgency that couldn't be faked. He didn't plead. He didn't beg. He simply spoke as someone who knew what this letter meant, as someone who had promised to deliver it, as someone who could not be late. The officers looked at each other again, this time longer. Then one of them handed the envelope back with an unexpected gentleness. The first words of apology weren't spoken aloud, but they lingered in the way his hands moved slower now, in the way he said, "We're going to help you get there." The boy blinked. For a moment he didn't move, didn't speak. His thoughts were too tangled with relief and disbelief. The moment of suspicion had passed, but its shadow hadn't. Still, he nodded, gently slid the envelope back into his bag, and stood ready. One officer popped the trunk of the cruiser and lifted the bike in. It barely fit, its back wheel resting awkwardly on a toolkit and a traffic cone. The boy climbed into the back seat, not in handcuffs, not under arrest, but still surrounded by the reminders of where he was and who they had thought he might be. The ride to the hospital began in silence. The streets passed in blurs. People walked dogs, opened shop gates, flagged down buses. None of them knew what had just happened. None of them saw how close time had come to being stolen by doubt. The sirens didn't wail, but the lights spun, carving their presence through the morning mist. In the seat behind glass, the boy held the backpack tightly in his lap, the envelope now warm again from the press of his body. For the first time since leaving his apartment, he allowed himself to think of what the letter actually said. He hadn't read it. His grandmother had told him not to. It wasn't his to open. But he had an idea. He had heard the stories late at night, half-whispered, of a man who had walked out one day and never walked back, of a family that had to rebuild its dignity in silence, of forgiveness that was easier to withhold than extend. But now, in that envelope, there might be healing, or a memory, or just words that had waited too long. As the hospital appeared in the distance, the boy leaned forward instinctively. The building rose through the mist, tall and solemn. This was it. His hands tightened around the straps of the backpack. The cruiser slowed. The officers didn't speak. They pulled up near the emergency entrance and let the engine idle. One officer opened his door and got out, walking around to the rear of the car. He opened the back door and nodded. The boy stepped out slowly, stretching his legs, then reached for the bike. The officer helped him lift it down, resting it gently on the sidewalk. They didn't exchange any more words. There wasn't a need. The moment had passed, but the story it left behind would stay with all of them, tucked like that envelope, quietly between the folds of memory. The moment his sneakers touched the ground outside the hospital entrance, everything felt heavier. Not just the backpack on his shoulders, but the pressure beneath his ribs, the weight of expectations unspoken, the quiet responsibility that had kept his legs pumping for 14 blocks without rest. The city noise seemed to mute itself behind him as the hospital doors slid open and cool, sterile air rushed out to meet him. The building loomed, white and beige under a bleached sky, tall but not intimidating. Until now. It had never looked so big, so important, so final. He stepped inside, holding the strap of his backpack tightly. The letter inside hadn't moved. Folded once, it had slipped to the bottom of the bag beneath the hoodie. As he approached the front desk, he didn't need to ask for directions. His grandmother had told him the room number twice, made him repeat it like a spell until it stuck. The receptionist gave him a look, half curiosity, half confusion, but said nothing as he walked past. There was something about him that didn't invite questions. Maybe it was the stillness in his expression or the sense of urgency in his stride, or maybe just the subtle way his eyes didn't wander. The hospital hallway was too clean, too bright, too quiet. Each footstep echoed slightly off the linoleum floor. Every passing cart creaked like a whisper. He passed nurses with clipboards, patients in wheelchairs, a doctor speaking quietly into a phone. None of them noticed the boy, or if they did, none stopped him. Room 308, he reminded himself. East wing, 3rd floor. The elevator was slow, so he took the stairs 2 at a time, heart pounding more from nerves than exertion. The letter burned like a live coal in his mind now, imagined weight pressing against his spine. When he reached the 3rd floor, the hallway greeted him like the rest, silent and tense. He paused outside room 308. The door was cracked open slightly. He could hear a machine beeping steadily inside, each tone a reminder of time passing, of breath being measured by something cold and clinical. He stepped in. The man in the bed was older than he remembered. Thinner, paler, hair turned to gray and thinning at the edges. Tubes ran from his arms to machines. His chest rose and fell slowly under the pale blanket, like the tide. Gentle, slow, inevitable. The boy didn't speak. He walked to the side of the bed and stood for a moment, looking down at a man who once had a voice that filled rooms and hands that built everything he touched. Now he looked smaller, deflated, but still here, still breathing, and still waiting. He reached into his bag and pulled out the envelope. It looked fragile now, paper soft with handling and time. The edges slightly curled, the ink just starting to smudge where it had been pressed against his hoodie. His thumb ran across the name written on the front. Charles Williams. No dad, no grandfather, no greeting. Just a name, written in his grandmother's careful, deliberate hand. He wondered how long she had sat up last night composing it. If her hands had trembled. If she had rewritten it more than once. He hadn't asked. He hadn't wanted to know. He placed the envelope gently on the man's chest. For a long time, nothing happened. Then the man stirred. Eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then blinking into clarity. They met the boy's for a moment, confused, almost blank. Then they dropped to the envelope. The man's hand moved slowly, shakily, over the paper. He picked it up. His fingers trembled as they broke the seal. He unfolded it carefully, as if it might break. And then he began to read. The boy stood still, unsure where to look. He focused on the machines instead. The heart monitor pulsing steadily, the IV line dripping at a slow, methodical pace. But then he heard something he hadn't expected. A sound not from the machines or the hallway, but from the man in the bed. It was soft, cracked, but unmistakable. The sound of someone breaking from the inside. A breath caught, a shoulder shook, and the man began to cry. Not loudly, not in sobs, but in the quiet, hollow way that grief expresses itself when it comes too late and too deep. Tears ran down the sides of his face, catching in his hair. His hands clutched the letter tightly now, knuckles white, fingers bent like claws. He held it to his chest as if it were a part of him, something returned from a place he had thought was lost. The boy didn't move. He let the man weep. Because some letters were not meant to be read. They were meant to be felt. Meant to be delivered with silence, meant to carry not just words but years of unsaid things, regret, hope, pain, love. His grandmother had written all of that into ink and paper. She had entrusted it to him, and now it had reached where it needed to go. After a while, the man looked up again. His eyes were red but focused now. They studied the boy more carefully. He said nothing. The silence stretched long, but it was not uncomfortable. It was necessary. It filled the space between two people who had never truly known each other, but were, in that moment, connected more deeply than most families ever become. The boy didn't wait for permission. He reached out, took the man's hand in his own, and held it. Skin against skin, warm and real. The man squeezed weakly. And that was enough. The machines beeped. The air stayed still. Outside the room, life continued. Phones rang. Nurses walked. Time moved forward, but inside room 308 something shifted. A wound closed a little. A past softened. And the future, uncertain and small as it might be, took its first breath. The air inside the hospital was heavier now, wrapped in silence as the boy stepped out of room 308. Each step echoed off the polished floor, not with fear or uncertainty, but with the kind of quiet finality that comes from knowing something important has been done. The walls, once cold and distant, now felt like silent witnesses to a truth passed from one hand to another. In the hushed corridor, nurses walked by with soft-soled shoes and hushed voices, heads bent over clipboards, unaware of the boy's internal shift. His feet moved slowly, tracing a straight path back toward the entrance. He didn't rush. The urgency that had propelled him across half the city on his bike had passed. Something else took its place now. A heavy calm, a strange sense of stillness that settled into his chest and made everything feel further away, quieter, slower. He didn't notice the officer waiting near the elevator until he heard a quiet cough behind him. Turning, he saw the same man who had helped load his bike into the cruiser. The officer didn't speak at first. He simply gave a small nod, then motioned toward the exit. No words were exchanged, and none were needed. They walked side by side, an unlikely pair. An officer in uniform with clipped strides and a boy in worn sneakers carrying a backpack too large for his frame. Together, they cut a quiet silhouette down the sterile hallway, past waiting rooms filled with folded magazines and tired eyes, past hospital staff who barely glanced their way. Outside, the afternoon sun had fought its way through the gray and was beginning to warm the sidewalks. The wind was softer now, more like a breeze than the biting chill it had been earlier that morning. The cruiser was parked at the curb. The officer opened the trunk and helped retrieve the bike. The boy thanked him quietly, voice rough from disuse, but the words were sincere. The officer didn't reply right away. He closed the trunk gently, then rested his hand on the handlebar of the bike, not to hold it back, but just to steady it. He asked if the boy had a safe place to go. The boy nodded. Home wasn't far. A few blocks. The officer paused, then offered a suggestion. He could escort him back. Not because of suspicion, not because of protocol, but because sometimes presence was protection, and appearance alone could be a shield. The boy hesitated, then agreed, and so the escort began. They didn't turn on the siren. No lights flashed. But the cruiser followed slowly behind the bike, matching its pace through quiet residential streets. A few neighbors looked up from their yards or porches as the boy passed, eyes flicking from the worn jacket to the police car, trailing him like a shadow. But no one stopped him. No one questioned. The boy pedaled with his back straight and his head high, not in defiance, but in clarity. He wasn't being chased. He wasn't being watched. He was being walked home. They passed storefronts with dusty windows and laundromats with neon signs blinking half-lit slogans. Children played in small yards fenced in by chain link. The world was ordinary again, but the boy wasn't. Not quite. He felt something changed inside, like the contents of his backpack had shifted even though he hadn't touched it. The envelope was gone, but its purpose still weighed on him. It would for a while. At the corner before his block, the cruiser slowed. The officer rolled down his window and waved once, a simple gesture that meant more than it showed. The boy nodded, then turned and pedaled the last stretch alone. The cruiser didn't follow. It simply idled for a moment, then turned in the opposite direction and vanished behind a row of trees. At home, the boy let his bike rest against the brick wall of the building and climbed the narrow stairwell to his apartment. Inside, It was quiet. His grandmother sat at the small kitchen table, a cup of tea in her hands. She looked up when he walked in, eyes scanning his face for answers. He nodded once. She smiled. Small, tired, but genuine. No words, just that. And it was enough. He placed his backpack by the door and stepped into the kitchen. The smell of tea leaves and something cooking on the stove greeted him gently. Home wasn't big, it wasn't new, but it held them both, and that made it enough. He sat down, and for the first time that day, he let himself exhale fully, deeply, completely. Out there, the world still spun. Out there, people still misjudged, still made assumptions, still acted on reflexes hardened by fear and habit. But inside this room, something had softened. Something had healed. Even just a little. The delivery had been made, the message received. The man in the hospital would live with that letter, maybe for a day, maybe for many. But either way, something had reached him that hadn't been able to for years, and the boy, once mistaken for a threat, had become something else entirely. A messenger, a grandson, a link in a broken chain trying to mend. Tomorrow, maybe nothing would look different. But today, for those who saw clearly, everything had changed. The room held a stillness that even time seemed to respect. As the boy stood near the hospital bed, where his grandfather lay surrounded by tubes and quiet machines, every sound inside was purposeful and precise. Each beep and soft hiss a reminder of the body's fragile negotiations with life. The room was dim, the curtain half drawn against the afternoon light, casting a soft blue hue across the walls. The boy's sneakers made no noise as he stepped closer. He didn't rush. There was no longer a need for speed. He had arrived. The letter had been read. But this moment was something else. It was not a delivery. It was a return. His grandfather lay still, eyes closed, but his breathing had changed. Slower, deeper. As if after reading the letter, some weight had been lifted, a message passed on from one part of life to another. The boy stood in silence for a while, unsure what to do next. No one had told him what to expect after this. The letter was the plan, the mission. Now that it had been read, now that the tears had come and gone, the air felt thick with something unspoken. He looked at the old man's face and tried to read something there. Recognition, relief, maybe even regret. But it was all quiet now, just the sound of machines doing their work. The boy finally sat down. The chair beside the bed creaked slightly under his weight. He folded his hands in his lap, shoulders hunched slightly forward. He kept his gaze on his grandfather even as time began to pass in long, slow minutes. His heartbeat had slowed. His thoughts wandered. He wondered what the letter had said. He hadn't read it. His grandmother had written it in the privacy of the living room, her back turned to him, the edges of her voice trembling as her pen moved. He knew it wasn't just words. It had to be more. A story, a confession, maybe a plea. Outside the room, voices passed by occasionally, muffled and distant. Once, a nurse peeked in and nodded gently at him before disappearing again. But mostly, the hospital faded into a kind of background silence, giving the boy and the man a bubble of space that felt like it existed outside normal time, as if they were waiting for something unseen to settle. His grandfather stirred again. The boy noticed a flicker of movement beneath the eyelids, a twitch in one finger. A moment later, the old man's eyes opened slowly, blinking against the dim light. His head turned slightly. His gaze landed on the boy. For a second, there was confusion, but then something else surfaced. Not quite a smile, not quite a tear, just a quiet acknowledgement, a shared knowing that the boy was there, that the message had arrived, that despite everything, distance, pain, silence, they had not missed the moment. The boy didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence had already said what words couldn't. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees, and simply held his grandfather's gaze. It wasn't like a movie scene. There was no dramatic music, no whispered apologies, no sudden declarations of love. But there was connection. There was weight. There was history in the way they looked at each other, layers of past and present folding silently into a single glance. The old man's fingers moved toward the edge of the blanket, searching. The boy reached out and took the hand gently. It was dry, cool, fragile, but it squeezed back, lightly. Then again, that was enough. The machines continued their rhythm. The boy leaned back, still holding the hand. His breathing settled into the same rhythm. The room held that stillness again, a deep and sacred kind that didn't demand attention but offered space. He stayed there for a long time. Minutes bled into hours. No one came to interrupt. No one needed to. This meeting wasn't on a schedule. It was rare, delicate, and final. Eventually, the boy's eyes began to close. He wasn't tired in the usual sense. It was more like something inside him had finally exhaled. He rested his head against the side of the bed for a moment, eyes half shut, one hand still wrapped in his grandfather's. In the hallway, life resumed its usual pace. The hospital returned to the business of tending to wounds and watching over moments both ordinary and urgent. But in room 308, everything moved slower, softer. The boy dozed lightly, one ear tuned to the sounds of breath and beeping. The old man lay still, his eyes closed again, but his expression was different now, relaxed, resolved. When a nurse finally returned to check on them, she paused at the doorway. She didn't enter. She just looked in, noted the boy asleep beside the bed, the two hands still joined, and quietly stepped away. Some scenes didn't need to be disturbed. Some meetings didn't require documentation or comment. They simply needed to be allowed. And so, time passed. The boy stayed beside his grandfather until the shadows shifted across the walls and the hum of evening began to settle in. When he finally stood to leave, he did so slowly, careful not to wake the man, even though he suspected he was already aware. He let go of the hand gently and adjusted the blanket. He stepped back once, twice, then turned toward the door. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The meeting had happened. It was quiet, it was wordless, but it had spoken volumes. In that room, through that letter, across time and silence, something had been repaired. Not everything, not perfectly, but something. And sometimes, something is all you need. As he stepped outside the hospital doors, the air felt different. Not just cooler, but clearer, as if the weight he had been carrying had finally been set down, even if no one else could see it. The sun was lower in the sky, edging toward dusk, casting long golden streaks along the pavement. The sounds of the city had returned. Car horns in the distance, a dog barking somewhere beyond a row of buildings, footsteps on sidewalks, but they no longer pressed in on him. They felt like they were part of the background now, instead of something closing in. The bicycle stood where the officer had helped him leave it, leaned carefully against the curb. It looked exactly the same, but he didn't. The boy's shoulders weren't as tight. His jaw wasn't clenched. His breath came freely without the burn of urgency in his chest. He walked slowly toward the bike, not because he was tired, but because he was taking a moment, just a breath between what had happened and whatever came next. He slid the backpack over his shoulder again, but it felt lighter now. The letter that had once given it so much weight was gone, delivered, read, received. It had done its work. He gripped the handlebars, mounted the bike, and pushed off without hesitation. The wheels rolled smoothly beneath him, and he leaned into the movement with ease. It wasn't the same ride he'd taken earlier. There was no frantic pace, no silent clock ticking behind his ribs. This ride was something else, something slower, something softer. He passed the same corners, the same storefronts, but they didn't feel like obstacles anymore. They felt familiar, almost gentle. The rusted signs and flickering windows no longer looked like barriers. They were just part of the route. The people he passed didn't seem to stare as long, or maybe he just didn't notice. Either way, it didn't matter. He wasn't hiding now. He wasn't rushing. He was just going home. The wind pressed gently against his face, brushing across his cheeks like a reminder that he was still moving, still alive, still carrying something forward even after everything had paused in that hospital room. The buildings around him seemed smaller now, the spaces between them wider, as if the city itself had loosened its grip. He passed a group of kids playing basketball in a cracked alley court and caught a moment of their laughter. He passed a woman sweeping her porch who glanced up and gave him a nod. He nodded back. It was simple. It was enough. When he reached his block, the street was quiet. A few neighbors were out, someone walking a dog, someone leaning against a railing smoking a cigarette. The familiar smells of cooking rice and detergent from a nearby laundromat drifted in the air. He turned into the alley beside his building and wheeled the bike to its usual spot. The frame clicked against the chain-link fence, and he leaned it carefully there like always. Inside the stairwell, the peeling paint and creaky steps welcomed him back. They hadn't changed. Neither had the worn doormat or the hum of the light in the hallway. But he had. He climbed the stairs without hurry, one hand on the railing, and paused briefly before his door. The weight in his chest was different now. It wasn't dread. It was something steadier. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. His grandmother was still in the kitchen, her back to him as she stirred something on the stove. The smell of spices filled the room, warm and rich. She didn't turn right away, but he knew she heard him. The kettle whistled softly. He set his bag down, took off his jacket, and sat at the table. She turned then, and their eyes met. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't need to. His face told the story. Her hands paused for a moment, resting on the edge of the stove, and then she nodded. That was all. That was enough. They ate in silence, the kind that doesn't need to be broken, the kind that holds everything. The evening faded into night, the apartment dimming with the sky, and still no words passed between them. But the boy's posture was different. He leaned back in his chair with ease, and his hands were steady. He looked out the window at the darkening street and didn't feel the need to escape. He was here, present. He had done something that mattered, even if the world kept turning like it didn't notice. Later, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he let his eyes close without resistance. No thoughts raced to pull him into restless dreams. No guilt, no fear, no lingering pressure. He simply let go. Sleep came easily. Tomorrow would come with its own questions, its own obstacles. People would forget. The city would move on. But the meeting had happened. The letter had been delivered. The man who had once been only a name had become a memory with a face again. Something quiet had been healed. Not everything, not all at once, but enough to start with. And the boy had ridden that truth all the way home.